History remembers inventions, strategies, generals, and nations. But every war and every moment where the world tilts off its axis is shaped by individuals whose actions seem too strange to be real. And this is the story of one such man, a soldier who seemed to belong not to the 20th century, but to the age of knights. A man who carried a broadsword into battles ruled by machine guns, who slung a longbow across his shoulder while the world embraced automatic rifles, who marched through mortar fire playing Scottish bagpipes as if daring death to interrupt the tune. His name was John Malcolm Thorpe Fleming Churchill, but on the battlefield he earned a different name, whispered with admiration by some and disbelief by others, Mad Jack Churchill. To understand the man, we begin before the gunfire, before the beaches, before the concentration camps, when Jack Churchill was born not into war, but into a world drifting toward it, a time when old empires still breathed, but their foundations were cracking, when Britain's officers were molded by stories of colonial campaigns fought with bayonets and cavalry. Jack grew up absorbing stories of personal valor, of men who looked their enemies in the eye, yet the world he would later fight in was evolving into something colder, faster, and industrial, and Jack Churchill would spend his life refusing to evolve with it. He joined the British Army in the 1920s, a quiet interwar period when the world pretended the Great War had settled everything. But Jack was different. Where others saw a career, he saw a stage, and where others sought stability, he sought adventure. He learned the longbow with a craftsman's obsession, practiced the bagpipes until he could play under rain, shell fire, or exhaustion, and trained with the basket-hilted broadsword not as a curiosity, but as a weapon he fully intended to use. During peacetime exercises, he startled fellow officers by riding a motorcycle across terrain others avoided, walking long distances alone to keep himself sharp, and firing arrows with unnerving accuracy. And one officer remarked that Churchill didn't merely practice old weapons, he believed in them. Even Churchill could not have predicted how soon the world would need men willing to fight in unconventional ways. But in September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland and Europe collapsed into conflict, Jack felt something he would never openly admit: purpose. War to him was clarity, a place where courage mattered more than paperwork, instinct more than protocol, and individuals could shift the balance through raw will. When the British Army formed its first commando units, elite troops built for daring raids and impossible tasks, Churchill volunteered immediately, and the recruiters didn't know they had just enlisted the man who had helped to define what a commando even was. On the first major raid to Norway, Churchill stood on the deck of a small British craft crossing the North Sea, gripping his longbow, sword at his hip, bagpipes beside him as ice formed on the rails and darkness blanketed everything. Soldiers stared at his weapons with confusion, amusement, and unease, and then Churchill delivered the line that would follow him for life: "Any officer who goes into action without his sword is improperly dressed." When his boots hit Norwegian snow, he lifted his bagpipes and played March of the Cameron Men, the sound echoing through the cold valley so eerily that German sentries stopped in confusion. Churchill drew an arrow, fired, and struck down a German soldier, the first longbow kill in a European war in centuries, verified by multiple eyewitnesses. This moment birthed the legend of Mad Jack. In Sicily, he charged Italian positions with his sword raised high. In Italy, he captured 42 German soldiers not through superior firepower, but through shock, confidence, and psychological dominance. He fought like a man out of time, and soldiers followed him because his courage made fear feel smaller. But war is not a stage, and even legends bleed. In 1944, during operations in Yugoslavia, a German mortar barrage tore apart the hillside around him. Dozens of partisans died, and Churchill continued playing the bagpipes even as shells landed closer, a detail so absurd that even German reports mention it. When his position was overrun, Churchill stood alone, out of ammunition, still wearing his sword and still calm, and he was captured, entering a chapter of his life unlike anything he had ever faced. Jack Churchill spent the bitter winter of 1944-45 behind barbed wire, not in a simple POW camp, but in Sachsenhausen, one of the Nazi regime's most infamous concentration camps, a place designed not for soldiers, but for political prisoners, resistors, and those the Reich wished to erase quietly. For the first time in the war, Churchill faced an enemy he could not charge with a sword. Electrified walls, manned guard towers. Escape meant death. Staying meant slow rot. But Churchill never surrendered mentally. He watched, calculated, studied the guards, the routines, the blind spots. Around him, Germany was collapsing in real time. Distant rumbles of Allied bombers, guards whispering anxiously about Soviet advances, falling towns, Hitler issuing impossible orders to units that no longer existed. The Reich was bleeding out, and when empires bleed, they become unpredictable. Churchill knew it was only a matter of time before the Nazis tried to eliminate their high-value prisoners, rather than let them fall into Allied hands. He had survived battlefields, medieval weapons, mortar fire, but now he faced bureaucratic murder. In late April 1945, as Berlin burned, Churchill and roughly 140 prominent prisoners were suddenly ordered out of their cells, bound for the South Tyrol region of northern Italy, where the SS hoped to use them as negotiating pawns in a last, desperate attempt to save themselves. The prisoners were herded into convoys, guarded by heavily armed SS men who were trapped between fear of the Allies and terror of their own collapsing hierarchy. Days blurred into nights, food ran out, the weather froze their skin, and no one knew if this was a transfer or a slow-motion execution. Churchill observed everything: the jumpy SS, the disgusted Wehrmacht, the fractured Nazi machine now split into competing factions. In this chaos, he saw opportunity. When the prisoners arrived in a small Italian mountain village, Churchill and others approached senior Wehrmacht officers, warning that the SS planned to massacre them. The officers knew it, and also knew the war was over. The SS had fanaticism, not authority. A German army captain, Wiechard von Alfsleben, made a historic decision. He ordered his soldiers to surround the SS guards. Two German factions faced each other at gunpoint, reason versus madness, until the SS backed down and abandoned the prisoners. Churchill, after nearly a year in captivity, was free. But freedom was not safety. Still deep in collapsing Nazi territory, most prisoners stayed put and waited for Allied units. But Churchill, who had survived mortars, invasions, and sword charges, refused to sit still. He turned south toward Allied lines, with no compass, no map, no supplies, an injured ankle, and a body worn thin from imprisonment. He marched through the Italian Alps, hiding from stray German units, scavenging water from streams, resting in abandoned farmhouses, limping through forests, valleys, and icy passes. After 8 days of solitude, pain, and sheer willpower, he reached the outskirts of Verona and encountered an American armored reconnaissance patrol. Ragged, unshaven, with torn uniform and missing insignia, he looked more like a lost mountaineer than a lieutenant colonel. Lacking identification, he convinced them by presence alone, with unbelievable but true stories, with authority in his voice, with the force of personality that had carried him through half the war armed with a sword. When he finished, a sergeant muttered, "Hell, I believe him." Churchill was processed, transported, and flown back to Britain. It was May 1945. Germany had surrendered. Europe's war was over. But Churchill's war was not. Returning home to celebrations, ringing bells and flags in every window, he felt disappointment. He had missed the final battles and had hoped to return to the front. Only Japan remained. Within days, he requested transfer to the Pacific, wanting one more landing, one more charge, one more test. The War Office approved it, telling Churchill no was pointless. By summer 1945, he was on his way east, unaware he would never get the battle he wanted. While he flew over India, the U.S. dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. Light brighter than the sun, a city destroyed, 80,000 dead instantly.
3 days later came Nagasaki. On August 15, Japan surrendered. For most soldiers, it was a blessed end. But for Churchill, a punch to the heart. He reportedly muttered, "If it wasn't for those damned Yanks dropping those bombs, we could have kept the war going for another 10 years. His comrades laughed, but they understood. Churchill wasn't bloodthirsty or insane. He simply felt alive in war in a way peace never allowed. And now, peace had returned. The map tables inside underground command centers told a story the public never saw. Thin red pencils marking German spearheads, thick blue grease strokes showing Allied pressure points, and small circles indicating fuel reserves that were evaporating faster than ammunition. By early 1944, Germany's war machine was no longer collapsing from enemy gunfire, but from mathematics, its panzer divisions falling not due to Allied might alone, but because their fuel consumption outpaced production by a ratio of 6-to-1. A Panther needed 730 liters of fuel to travel 100 kilometers, a Tiger more than 1,000. Yet by spring 1944, synthetic fuel plants were producing less than 10% of what was required to sustain two fronts. Hitler kept ordering counterattacks while his generals silently wondered with what fuel, what engines, and what time left, knowing the answer but afraid to speak it. Above them, the skies over Germany became an invisible front, where bombing raids destroyed not just factories, refineries, and rail yards, but morale itself. Luftwaffe officers attending briefings centered on loss reports rather than pilots or squadrons, realizing Germany wasn't losing planes, it was losing time, the one resource no nation at war can reclaim. By late April 1944, Berlin looked functional on the surface, with government cars moving and trains running. But inside the Führer bunker, the truth seeped through the concrete. Hitler no longer received full operational maps as staff filtered reports to avoid his rage, while the silence itself revealed everything. The air feeling thinner and the walls echoing differently, prompting General Hans Krebs to write that they were not fighting the Allies anymore, but inevitability. Meanwhile, 1,200 kilometers east, the Eastern Front was sustained by ghost divisions, units with 3,000 men instead of 15,000, armored regiments with 4 working tanks, infantry companies made of teenagers holding rifles they had learned to use only weeks earlier, forces defeated not by the Red Army, but by distance, cold, hunger, and time. The true turning point of the war was not Normandy, Stalingrad, or Kursk, but the collapse of German railway logistics. With 40% of locomotives destroyed in the first half of 1944, trains carrying fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and men never reached the front. A Tiger tank defeated by a missing rail car, a Messerschmitt defeated by an empty fuel drum, a German soldier defeated by an auger arriving 3 days late. Germany's chances killed not by battles, but by infrastructure. As April turned to May, Berlin became a city suspended in time, where church bells still rang, children still played, and factories still roared. Yet the war had already slipped through Germany's fingers, understood only by a few men in the deepest bunkers who sensed how rapidly the sand was running out, every hour growing heavier, every day shorter, as Berlin's leadership clung to a war that, by every scientific measure, was already lost. Germany still possessed weapons that terrified Allied intelligence, machines that looked unstoppable on paper, weapons that should have altered the course of the war, devices so advanced that generals in Washington and London wondered whether they were already too late. But this part of history, the part few discuss, is that Germany's brilliant technology was born into a dying ecosystem where infrastructure, supply chains, and fuel reserves were collapsing faster than innovation could keep up. The so-called Wunderwaffe, V-2 rockets, Me-262 jets, Panther tanks, Type 21 submarines were not failures of engineering, but failures of systems, because wars are not won by single machines. They are won by the ability to produce those machines in the tens of thousands, repair them endlessly, transport them, fuel them, and keep them operational. And while Germany had brilliance, the Allies had systems, and systems always win. Inside Hitler's Wolf's Lair, late-night meetings with engineers from BMW, Messerschmitt, Junkers, and the rocket program became acts of desperation. Each blueprint, another gamble in a race against collapse. Every new weapon costing precious time and resources the Reich could no longer afford. One Me-262 jet fighter consumed enough high-alloy metals to build 12 Panzer IVs. One V-2 rocket required 30 tons of fuel that the Luftwaffe desperately needed. And a single Tiger tank absorbed the machining hours required to equip 2 infantry divisions. Hitler wasn't choosing the wrong weapons. He was choosing extremely expensive ones at the exact moment Germany needed cheap, mass-produced tools of war. The Me-262 jet fighter, capable of 870 kilometers per hour and able to vaporize a B-17 with its 30mm cannons, was the most advanced aircraft of the war.
Yet it entered combat in an ecosystem with almost no fuel, barely trained pilots, scarce spare engines, and airfields with no protection, its jet engines needing overhaul every 10 hours, while Germany lacked the alloys required to maintain them. The V-2 rocket program, an engineering triumph but a strategic disaster, cost more than the entire Manhattan Project while achieving no impact on Allied logistics, strategy, or troop movement. Only civilian casualties, with each rocket consuming materials that could have built 20 fighter planes and fuel that could have powered 30 Me-109 sorties. It didn't lose the war for Germany, but it ensured the Reich could never recover. The Tigers and Panthers, endlessly romanticized, were defeated not by Allied tanks, but by their own maintenance nightmares. More than half of all Tiger tanks were lost to fuel shortages, engine failures, transmission breakdowns, abandonment, or self-destruction to avoid capture, making them kings that required an empire Germany no longer possessed. In early 1944, a confidential report from the German Army Weapons Office concluded that Germany could no longer replace battlefield losses and would not be capable of sustaining a war in 1945, a bureaucratic admission of mathematical defeat so stark that those who read it burned their copies, knowing no weapon could save the Reich because weapons don't win wars, systems do, and by 1944, Germany's systems were already dead. When people imagine the collapse of the German war machine, they picture burning tanks, shattered divisions, and Allied armies crossing Europe. But the real collapse, the collapse that determined everything, happened far behind the front lines, in rooms no camera ever saw, on trains that never arrived, in factories that never finished their shifts, and in supply lines that had run dry months before any Allied soldier reached the Rhine. The collapse of Germany's invisible front lines, where war was lost not in trenches or forests, but in mathematics, fuel ratios, and destroyed railway junctions, the part almost no documentary explains, yet the part that makes clear why nothing Germany ever attempted after 1944 ever mattered. Germany's entire war machine breathed the same oxygen, oil, and by mid-1944, the Reich had less than 10% of the fuel needed to sustain modern war, and worse, by autumn, it no longer had the chemical base required to produce synthetic fuel, leaving the war machine nothing more than steel, and steel without fuel cannot move, fly, or fight. It simply rusts. Ploiești, Romania, the most heavily defended patch of ground in Europe, was the heart of Hitler's oil strategy, yet even at peak output, it could supply only half what Germany required. Germany needed 11 million tons per year, Ploiești produced 5.5 million, and after relentless Allied bombing in 1944, production collapsed by 80%, grounding the Luftwaffe, parking tanks in barns, ending training flights, and turning submarines into floating coffins. As oil didn't merely run out, it vanished, taking Germany's future with it. Meanwhile, as the Allies fought across France, a quieter war unfolded above them. The systematic destruction of the German railway network, the single most important military asset of the Reich, because Germany was not a mechanized empire, but a rail empire. 90% of ammunition, 85% of fuel, 95% of infantry reinforcements, and every tank, aircraft engine, and gun barrel moved by train, so when the Allies executed the transportation plan, bombing rail hubs in a coordinated offensive, the effect was not immediate, but it was fatal. Factories remained intact, but their products never reached the front. Armies existed on paper, but their reinforcements never arrived. Tanks rolled off assembly lines but waited idle because their engines never came. And the Reich was not defeated in battle, but strangled slowly. Artillery, the weapon that decides modern battles, was reduced to fragments of its former power, as officers fought a hopeless war of rationing, where batteries once fired 12,000 shells a day. By late 1944, many fired fewer than 200, turning artillery units into monuments rather than weapons. And monuments do not win wars. The Luftwaffe's collapse was not a story of missing aircraft, but of missing pilots. Training hours fell from 240 to 40, fuel for practice vanished, 80% of new pilots died within 2 weeks, entire squadrons flew without ever having trained in clouds, and one ace wrote that they no longer fought Americans, but physics, because no miracle weapon could save a pilot who had never practiced landing. Speer's much-celebrated increase in armaments output in 1944 meant nothing, because production exceeded logistics, not losses. Germany built aircraft with no fuel, tanks with no crews, guns with no shells, trucks with no rubber, submarines with no diesel, jet fighters with no spare engines, and rockets that burned more fuel than the damage they inflicted, proving a war machine cannot function on production alone. It lives or dies on supply chains, and Germany's were already dead. By mid-1944, even if Hitler had summoned 10,000 tanks, 5,000 jets, or a new miracle weapon every month, it would have changed nothing, because there was no fuel to run them, no rails to move them, no pilots to fly them, no ammunition to load them, no factories to repair them, no radar network to shield them, and no bridges to deploy them. Germany was not losing the war, it was already dead. And the frontline armies were the last to realize it.
By late 1944 and early 1945, the German armies were not only losing territory, but losing leadership, clarity, and their grip on reality itself, as the command system that had once thrived on discipline, speed, and ruthless precision began to fracture from within, not because generals suddenly disagreed with Hitler, for they had disagreed for years, but because the entire hierarchy no longer believed orders had meaning, and a command is only as powerful as its connection to reality, a connection the Reich had lost by 1945. The first sign of collapse appeared in the silence between orders. In healthy armies, orders move instantly from top to generals to staff to regiments to soldiers. But in late-war Germany, that chain became a maze, as soldiers wrote in letters and diaries about orders arriving late or in contradiction or not at all, with divisions receiving one order from Hitler's headquarters, another from Army Group, another from the local corps commander, and a fourth from a disconnected staff officer trying to impose logic, leaving commanders wondering whether to follow the order that would get them court-martialed or the one that would get them annihilated. This was not simple disorder. It was administrative paralysis, the transformation of the once efficient blitzkrieg machine into a tangle of conflicting voices. Inside the Wolf's Lair, and later the Führer bunker, Hitler's daily briefings devolved into strategy, into denial, with curtains drawn, thick smoke in the air, officers silent, Hitler pacing with a trembling hand, maps held down by coffee cups, and generals pointing at units that no longer existed, turning command into theater where the script had already collapsed, summarized by the staff officer who said, "We were no longer reporting facts, we were reporting what the Führer needed to hear." A single admission that explains the final collapse, because no war can be won by lying upward. Hitler's mindset in these final months was not the hysterical rage often depicted, but a calm, fatalistic nihilism, born of the belief that Germany had failed him. He repeated that if the German people could not achieve victory, they did not deserve to survive, a thought that hollowed out the chain of command and poisoned every level beneath him. As officers realized Hitler's orders no longer reflected battlefield reality, a silent mutiny emerged. not a coup, but a quiet rebellion of interpretation, where an order to attack meant withdraw to a defensible line, an order to hold meant delay and retreat, and an order for a counteroffensive meant break contact and save the remnants of the division. Hitler recognized this and responded with threats, executions, and purges, but fear cannot command an army that has already internally surrendered. By late 1944 and early 1945, the German High Command had split into three psychological camps: the realists, like Guderian, Model, and Kesserling, who knew the war was lost and fought only to delay collapse; the fatalists, like Hitler, Himmler, and Keitel, who believed surrender was worse than annihilation and embraced destruction as ideological purification; and the fantasists, like Jodl, Bergdorf, and Bormann, who clung to imaginary jet fleets, phantom divisions, miracle weapons, and reinforcements that did not exist, producing a headquarters where three incompatible realities competed for dominance, a fracture no army could survive. Inside Hitler's bunker, the situation maps showed full-strength divisions that in reality were destroyed, encircled, reduced to 50 men, starving, or missing for weeks. And these illusions gave Hitler confidence, while giving his officers despair, because wars are not won on maps. They are lost when maps lie, and Hitler was commanding shadows. The final breaking point came when he ordered that no German soldier was to retreat, and every position must be held to the last man. Officers nodded, saluted, walked out of the bunker, and told their units to pull back, save themselves, and ignore Berlin, marking the moment Germany ceased to be a nation under command and became a nation driven solely by the instinct to survive, even if survival required disobeying the Führer. Jack Churchill's story and the stories of the men and women who endured the collapse of Nazi Germany remind us that history is never just dates and battles, but the courage of individuals, the decisions of leaders, and the consequences of human action under imaginable pressure. From storming beaches with a sword and bagpipes, to walking 150 kilometers through enemy territory, to navigating the chaos of falling regimes. Stories that test the limits of bravery, strategy, and resilience. If this journey through the final months of the Second World War moved you, inspired you, or revealed the human side of history in a new way, keep these stories alive by engaging and sharing. Like if you want to see more forgotten histories brought back from the shadows. Subscribe and enable notifications so no story or hero is lost. And comment to share where you're watching from, a family story of wartime experience, or the part of history that fascinates you most. History is alive, and your voice helps preserve it, honoring the courage, the chaos, and the extraordinary people who lived through it.